There are moments in history when faith speaks through silence, when devotion requires no stage, no audience, no applause, when love persists not through grand declarations, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to abandon those who can no longer speak for themselves. This is the story of a mother who had nothing left but her presence, and it was enough. This is the story of Risp, a woman whose name most people have never heard, a woman who held no throne, commanded no army, performed no miracles, a woman who simply would not leave. In the ancient world, women like Risbar were often invisible. Their stories were not recorded. Their voices were not heard. They moved through history like shadows, present but unacknowledged, essential but unremembered. But Rispa's story survived. It survived because what she did was so extraordinary in its simplicity, so profound in its faithfulness, that it could not be forgotten. It survived because even kings were moved by it. It survived because it speaks to something fundamental about love, about grief, about the kind of faith that does not need to be loud to be powerful. Tonight we tell her story, not because it offers easy comfort or simple answers, but because it reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of faith happen in silence and patience, in the determination to stay present when everything else has fallen apart. This is a story about a mother and her sons, about justice and mercy, about covenants made and broken, about a kingdom seeking answers and a land crying out for healing, and at the center of it all, one woman on a rock refusing to move. Let us begin. Chapter 1. A kingdom still paying for old sins. The kingdom of Israel had seen better days. King David sat on the throne in Jerusalem, a man who had risen from shepherd boy to sovereign, who had united the fractured tribes of Israel into something resembling a nation, who had established a capital that would echo through millennia of human history. But even in his strength, even in his victories, there were seasons when the land itself seemed to turn against him. The famine came quietly at first, a poor harvest one year, nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be managed with careful rationing and hopeful prayers for a better season ahead. But then came another poor harvest, and then a third. The grain stores began to dwindle. The livestock grew thin, their ribs visible beneath dull coats. The people began to murmur, not in rebellion or open complaint, but in that desperate, bewildered confusion that comes when the natural order seems broken, and no one can understand why. Israel was accustomed to hardship. They were a people whose entire history was marked by trials and testing, by wandering and waiting, by seasons of plenty followed by seasons of want. But this was different. This felt targeted, deliberate, as though the land itself had withdrawn its cooperation. The fields that should have produced wheat yielded only sparse, stunted stalks. The olive trees dropped their fruit before it ripened. The vines withered despite careful tending. It was as though some invisible hand had placed a curse upon the earth, preventing it from giving what it had always given before. David was not a man to ignore such signs. He had learned through decades of running for his life and fighting for his kingdom to recognize when something was wrong at a deeper level than mere circumstance. He had learned to seek God in times of crisis, to bring his questions directly to the source of all wisdom and judgment. He had done it as a young man, fleeing from King Saul's jealous rage, hiding in caves and trusting God to preserve him when every rational calculation said he should be dead. He had done it as a warrior, facing giants and armies and impossible odds. He had done it as a king, navigating civil war and family tragedy in the complex moral terrain of ruling a nation. And so he did it again now, bringing his question before the Lord with the kind of directness that had always marked his relationship with the divine. Why is this happening? What have we done? Why is the land refusing to yield? The answer came, and it was not what anyone expected. The famine was not random. It was not a test of faith to be endured with patience and prayer. It was not a natural disaster or a temporary setback that would resolve itself with time. It was a response to an unpaid debt, a consequence of an injustice committed years before by a man who was now dead, King Saul. The name hung in the air like smoke from a long extinguished fire. Saul, the first king of Israel, the man who had preceded David on the throne. Saul, who had started with such promise, anointed by the prophet Samuel, standing head and shoulders above every other man in Israel, chosen by God himself to lead his people. Saul, who had ended his life in madness and ruin, defeated by the Philistines, dying by his own sword on Mount Gilboa while his kingdom crumbled around him. Saul, whose reign had been marked by increasingly erratic behavior, by paranoia and jealousy, by a slow, agonizing unraveling of divine favor that culminated in God himself turning away from him. David had lived in Saul's shadow for years. He had been hunted by him, pursued across the wilderness like an animal, forced to flee his own country and take refuge among Israel's enemies. He had mourned Saul despite everything, had written a lament for him and Jonathan that was still sung among the people. He thought that chapter of history was closed, but apparently it was not. God revealed to David that the famine was connected to something Saul had done during his reign, an act of violence that had never been properly addressed, never been answered for. Generations earlier, during the initial conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, Israel had encountered a people called the Gibeonites. They were Canaanites, inhabitants of the land that Israel had been commanded to take. But the Gibeonites were clever. Realizing they could not defeat Israel in battle, they resorted to deception. They came to Joshua's camp dressed in worn-out clothes, carrying moldy bread and cracked wineskins, pretending to be travelers from a distant land who had heard of Israel's God and wanted to make a treaty. Joshua and the leaders of Israel, not seeking God's counsel in that moment, believed the deception and made a covenant with them, swearing an oath in the name of the Lord that the Gibeonites would be allowed to live. When the truth was discovered, or when Israel realized the Gibeonites were actually their neighbors living just a few miles away, it was too late. The oath had been sworn, the covenant had been made, and in that ancient world, such oaths were not mere formalities. They were binding, sacred, carrying the weight of divine witness. So the Gibeonites were spared. They were relegated to servitude, made woodcutters and water carriers for Israel. But their lives were protected. The covenant stood for generations. It held until Saul. Saul in his zeal had broken that ancient oath. The details of his campaign were not recorded in full. Perhaps it was driven by some misguided sense of national purity, a belief that Israel should be completely free of Canaanite influence. Perhaps it was simply cruelty, another symptom of the corruption that had infected his reign. Perhaps it was paranoia, seeing threats where none existed. Whatever the motivation, Saul had attempted to exterminate the Gibeonites. He had violated the covenant that Joshua had made centuries before. He had shed innocent blood, blood that was protected by a sacred oath. And now, years after Saul's death, the land was demanding an answer. David sat with this revelation, understanding the gravity of what he was being told. A broken covenant was not a small matter. It was not something that could be dismissed or forgotten or swept under the administrative rug of kingdom management. Covenants, especially those sworn in God's name, created obligations that transcended individual lives and generations. The famine was a sign that this injustice still lingered unresolved, like a wound left untreated that had become infected and was now poisoning the entire body. Justice delayed for years was now being demanded, and as king, David had to respond. Chapter 2. The Cost of a Broken Promise. David sent messengers to the Gibeonites. It must have been a strange summons to receive. The Gibeonites were not Israelites. They were outsiders who had survived through deception centuries ago and had lived since then on the margins of Israelite society. They were not warriors. They were not merchants or landowners of any significance. They were servants, laborers, people who existed in that ambiguous space between slavery and citizenship. And now the king of Israel was asking to meet with them. And the meeting took place with the kind of formality that such occasions required. But there was an unusual quality to it. This was not a king summoning subjects to give commands. This was a king acknowledging a wrong and asking what could be done to make it right. David's question was simple and direct. What can be done to atone for what Saul did to you? What would justice require? How can this covenant be honored after it has been broken? The Gibeonites must have discussed among themselves before answering. They were being given an opportunity that few people in their position ever received, the chance to name the terms of their own recompense, to define what justice would look like from their perspective. They did not ask for gold. They did not ask for silver or livestock or land. They did not request wealth or status or any material compensation that might improve their standing in Israelite society. They asked for something far more personal, far more final. They asked for blood. Specifically, they requested that 7 male descendants of Saul be handed over to them. 7 men from the house that had wronged them. 7 lives to answer for the covenant that had been violated, for the blood that had been shed unjustly. It was not a request born of simple cruelty or revenge, though surely there was anger in it. Anger that had been carried for years without any outlet or acknowledgement. But more than that, it was a request born of the legal and spiritual understanding of their time. That justice for bloodshed required an accounting. That life answered for life. That covenants carried weight in the cosmic order of things. In their worldview, and in the worldview of ancient Israel, wrongs left unaddressed would continue to fester. They would poison the land, disrupt the natural order, create imbalances that manifested in ways like famine and drought. Justice was not merely about punishment. It was about restoring balance, about making things right at a fundamental level. David listened to their request. He could have refused. He had the power to do so. He could have argued that Saul was dead, that his crimes died with him, that a new generation should not be held accountable for the sins of their father. He could have offered alternatives, different forms of compensation, other ways to acknowledge the wrong without requiring death. But he did not. David understood what was being asked, and he understood the cost of leaving the matter unresolved. The famine was not going to end on its own. The land was crying out for justice, and justice in this case meant honoring the covenant that had been broken, even if that honor came at a terrible price. So David agreed to the Gibeonites' terms. But he made one exception, and it was an exception that revealed his own understanding of covenant and obligation. There was a man named Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who was Saul's son. Mephibosheth was crippled, unable to walk, a survivor of the violence that had destroyed Saul's house. He lived in obscurity, essentially powerless, no threat to anyone. But David had made a covenant with Jonathan years before when they were young men, and David was still fleeing from Saul's murderous rage. Jonathan had been David's closest friend. He had protected him, had warned him, had loved him like a brother. And in the way of that ancient world, David and Jonathan had made a covenant of friendship that included a promise that David would show kindness to Jonathan's descendants. Mephibosheth was protected by that covenant. David would not hand him over. He would not violate the oath he had made to Jonathan, even to satisfy the demands of justice for another violated oath. Covenant mattered to David. Both covenants, the one to the Gibeonites that Saul had broken, and the one to Jonathan that David himself had made. But the others were not protected. 7 men from the house of Saul were identified. 2 of them were the sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine. Their names were Armoni and Mebos, though this was a different Mebos than Jonathan's son. 5 others were the sons of Meab. See, Saul's daughter, though some accounts suggest they were her sister Michal's responsibility, raised by Meab after Michal's own complicated relationship with David. These 7 men were not guilty of any crime themselves. They had not participated in Saul's campaign against the Gibeonites. They were simply descendants, family members, people who carried the burden of their lineage. But in the logic of covenant justice, their kinship made them liable. The decision was made. The men were gathered. The decree was issued. They would be handed over to the Gibeonites to satisfy the demand for justice, to answer for the covenant that had been broken. And so it was done. Chapter 3. Introducing Rizpah. Rizpah had known loss before. She had been the concubine of King Saul, which meant she occupied a peculiar place in the social hierarchy of ancient Israel. She was not a wife in the full sense, not afforded the same status or protections, but she was not a slave either. She was something in between, a woman whose value was derived entirely from her relationship to a powerful man and from the son she bore him. She had borne Saul 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, in a different life, in a different kingdom. Those boys might have grown up to be princes. They might have had prospects, opportunities, futures measured in power and influence. But Saul's kingdom had not lasted. His reign had ended in disaster on Mount Gilboa, where he and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, had died fighting the Philistines. The kingdom had fractured. The house of Saul had collapsed. Rizpah had survived that collapse. She had endured the chaos that followed Saul's death when rival factions fought for control. When Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, briefly held power before being assassinated, when David finally consolidated his rule over all Israel. She had lived through all of that with her 2 sons. Armoni and Mephibosheth had grown into men. They were not heirs to any throne that still existed. They were not warriors of particular renown. They were not wealthy or powerful, but they were alive and they were hers. And in the narrow space of her existence, that had been enough. They were what remained of her life, the only continuity she had after everything else had been lost, until word came that they were among those to be handed over. There was no hearing. There was no trial or opportunity for defense. And there was no one asking whether these particular men had done anything to deserve death. The decision had been made at a level far above her in negotiations between kings and aggrieved peoples and consultations with God about justice and covenants. Rizpah had no voice in any of it. She was not consulted. She was not even informed until the decision was already final. She was a woman, a concubine, someone whose opinion carried no weight in the halls of power where such matters were decided. She could not appeal to David. She could not plead with the Gibeonites. She could not argue that her sons were innocent, that they had nothing to do with Saul's crimes, that justice should not fall on them. None of that mattered. The covenant demanded satisfaction. The famine demanded an answer, and her sons were part of that answer. Swept up in the machinery of divine justice and political necessity, Rizpah could only watch as they were taken away. She could only stand helpless as the men she had raised, the children she had borne in pain and nursed and loved, were led away to die for crimes they had never committed. And then they were gone. Chapter 4. The bodies left exposed. The execution took place at the beginning of the barley harvest in the early weeks of spring, when the fields were just beginning to yield their first crops. 7 men were put to death in Gibeah, the hometown of Saul, the place where his reign had begun so many years before. There was a bitter symmetry to it, a closing of a circle that had started with such promise and hope. The method of execution is not described in detail, but the text uses a word that suggests they were hanged or exposed in some public manner. This was not a private affair, not something done quickly and hidden away. It was a public act meant to demonstrate that the covenant had been honored, that the demand for justice had been satisfied, and then in keeping with the judgment that had been pronounced, the bodies were left. This was part of what the Gibeonites had requested, part of what constituted justice in their eyes. The bodies were not to be buried immediately. They were to remain exposed, visible, a testament to what had occurred in that ancient world. Leaving a body unburied was a mark of profound dishonor. Proper burial was essential for human dignity, for the respect owed to the dead. To leave someone exposed was to treat them as less than human, and to deny them even the minimal courtesy that every person deserved. It was not uncommon for executed criminals to be left this way. It served as a warning, a deterrent, a public demonstration of what happened to those who violated the law or offended the powerful. The Romans would later perfect this practice with crucifixion, leaving bodies on crosses for days as a message to anyone who might consider rebellion. But these 7 men were not criminals, not in any ordinary sense. They were victims of circumstance, sacrifices to a justice that operated according to rules older and more terrible than individual guilt or innocence. The land was silent around them. The harvest began. Workers moved through the nearby fields, cutting barley, gathering the grain that would feed the community through the coming year. Life continued its rhythms, and people went about their business. The world moved forward as it always does, indifferent to individual tragedies. But the bodies remained. Days passed. The sun rose and set. Birds circled overhead, drawn by instinct to what hung there. Animals moved in the periphery, waiting for their opportunity. And Risper came to see what had become of her sons. She stood at a distance at first, perhaps unable to approach, unable to fully process what she was seeing. The bodies of Armin and Mephibosheth, alongside the 5 others exposed to the elements, beginning already the process of decay that claims all flesh. She could have turned away. She could have gone home, wherever home was for her now. She could have withdrawn into her grief, hidden herself away, let the world deal with the aftermath of its own justice. But she did not. Chapter 5. And the vigil begins. Rispa did not scream or wail or tear her garments in public display. She did not collapse in the dust or curse God or David or the Gibeonites for what they had done. She simply stayed. She gathered sackcloth, the coarse fabric worn in mourning, rough and uncomfortable against the skin, meant to be a physical manifestation of internal anguish, and she spread it on a rock near where the bodies had been placed, creating a kind of camp, a station from which she could keep watch. And she sat down, and she did not leave. The first day passed slowly. The hours stretched out under the spring sun. Risper sat on her rock, wrapped in sackcloth, her eyes fixed on the remains of her sons. When birds came, as they inevitably did, drawn by the scent of death and decay, she moved. She stood. She waved her arms. She shouted. And she drove them away again and again. Throughout that first day, she protected the bodies from the scavengers that nature sent. Every time a crow or vulture circled close, every time one landed and hopped forward with that distinctive predatory gait, Risper was there, a human barrier between the dead and the creatures that would desecrate them. As the sun set on that first day, she must have been exhausted. The emotional toll alone would have been crushing, the physical act of maintaining constant vigilance under the sun draining. But she did not leave. When darkness fell, new threats emerged. Animals that hunted and scavenged at night, creatures emboldened by the cover of darkness. Jackals, perhaps, their eerie calls echoing across the hills. Wild dogs that ran in packs. Other predators that saw the exposed bodies as an opportunity. But Rib remained. She kept a fire burning, perhaps, to ward off the animals. She stayed alert through the night, listening for sounds of approach, ready to shout and throw stones and do whatever was necessary to keep the bodies protected. The second day dawned, and still she was there. The third day, the fourth, a week passed. No one had asked her to do this. There was no law requiring it, no tradition demanding it. No one would have blamed her for going home, for accepting what had happened, for beginning the process of moving forward with whatever remained of her life. But Riz would not move. Her vigil was not a protest, not in any organized or political sense. She was not making demands or issuing statements or trying to change policy. She was not calling for the bodies to be taken down or the judgment to be reversed. She was simply refusing to abandon her sons. She was ensuring that their final days, however many there would not be spent alone and forgotten. She was determined that if the world had decided they were not worth bearing properly, she would at least make certain they were not treated as though they had never mattered at all. Week after week, Risper kept her station on the rock. Chapter 6. Through heat and storm, days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched toward months. The barley harvest came and went. Workers finished cutting the grain, threshing it, storing it away. The wheat harvest followed. Spring gave way to early summer, and through it all, Risper remained on her rock. The weather began to shift. The mild temperatures of spring gave way to the building heat of summer. In that region, summer could be brutal, especially out in the open with no shelter, no shade, no respite from the sun. The heat shimmered off the stones during the day. The air became thick and still, pressing down like a physical weight. The sun beat relentlessly on everything exposed to it, leaching moisture, cracking earth, making every breath feel like an effort. Risper endured it. She wrapped a sackcloth around her head for some protection, but there was little she could do against the full force of summer in that exposed place. Her skin darkened and dried. Her lips cracked. Her body grew gaunt from the constant vigilance, the interrupted sleep, the minimal food and water she must have consumed while maintaining her watch. But she did not leave. When the occasional rains came, as they sometimes do even in the dry season, a brief, violent storms that sweep in without warning, she did not seek shelter. She pulled the sackcloth tighter around herself and stayed where she was, rain streaming down her face, soaking through her clothes, turning the dust around her to mud. The rock beneath her became slick. Water pulled in the depressions. Thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning split the darkness of storm clouds. And still Risper remained. People must have passed by occasionally, travelers on nearby roads, farmers tending fields within sight of the hill, shepherds moving their flocks through the area. They would have seen her, the solitary figure on the rock day after day, night after night, keeping her impossible vigil. Some might have whispered about her as they passed. Some might have felt pity. Some might have thought her mad. Unable to accept what had happened, clinging to the dead in a way that defied reason. But Risper did not speak to them. She did not call out for help or sympathy or understanding. She did not try to explain herself or justify what she was doing. She simply remained. Her vigil was not performed for an audience. It was not done to make a point or garner sympathy or change anyone's mind about anything. It was done for her sons, for Armony and Mabos, who could no longer speak or move or defend themselves, who had been reduced to remains exposed on a hillside, who existed now only in the memory of those who had known them. Risper would not let them be forgotten. She would not let their final existence be marked solely by abandonment and dishonor. If she could do nothing else for them, if she could not save them or bring them back, or even give them proper burial, she could at least ensure they were not alone. She could be present, and so she was. The weeks continued to pass. The summer heat reached its peak. The world around her cycled through its rhythms, indifferent to her grief. But Whisper's determination did not waver. Every morning when the sun rose, she was there. Every evening when it set, she was there. Every night when darkness fell and the world became threatening and strange, she was there week after week after week. Through heat that would have driven most people to shelter, through storms that would have sent anyone else running for cover, through the endless grinding passage of time that wore down everything except her resolve. Risper remained. Chapter 7. A Mother's Faith. There is a kind of faith that is loud and dramatic. It prays in public places, making sure everyone can hear the eloquence and passion of its petitions. It makes grand declarations of trust and devotion. It calls down fire from heaven and parts seas and raises the dead. It performs miracles and signs and wonders that leave no doubt about the power of God and the righteousness of the faithful. The Bible is full of such faith. Moses stretching out his staff over the Red Sea, Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Peter stepping out of the boat to walk on water, Paul and Silas singing hymns in prison while the earth shook and their chains fell off. Faith that moves mountains. Faith that heals diseases. Faith that speaks with authority and expects immediate results. A change anything. Not because it will bring change anything. Not because it will bring them back or alter what has already occurred, but simply because honor is owed. The faith that trusts God even when understanding is absent. Even when the path forward is unclear. Even when the heart is broken beyond any hope of repair. The faith that does not require explanation or justification because it exists at a level deeper than words. Rizabah's vigil was an expression of that quieter faith. She did not question the justice that had taken her sons. There is no record of her arguing with God or demanding explanations or insisting that what had been done was wrong. She did not challenge the covenant obligation or dispute the terms of satisfaction that the Gibeonites had requested. She simply loved. And in that love, she remained faithful to the lives that had been entrusted to her. Her sons were gone. Their futures had been taken from them. Their deaths had served a purpose in the cosmic machinery of justice and covenant. But that did not make them any less dead, any less mourned, any less precious to the woman who had borne them. Risper could not change what had happened. She could not reverse the decision or bring them back, or even give them proper burial. Not yet. Not until someone with authority decided it was time. But she could be faithful to their memory. She could ensure that their final days were not spent utterly alone and forgotten. She could love them in death as she had loved them in life, completely and without reservation. Her faith was not theological in the sense of being based on doctrine or systematic understanding of God's nature. She did not quote scripture or make arguments about divine justice or human responsibility. Her faith was maternal. It was the kind of devotion that does not need to be explained because it exists in the bones, in the blood, in the deep places where love is formed and cannot be extracted no matter what happens. It was the faith of presence, the faith that says, I will not leave you no matter what. And it was witnessed not by crowds or armies or prophets, but by the birds she drove away, and the animals she frightened off, and the occasional travelers who passed by and saw the solitary figure on the rock day after day after day. Her faith required no miracles. It required no vindication. It required no promise of reward or acknowledgement. It simply was. And in being exactly what it was, in manifesting as pure, stubborn, unshakable devotion, it became something remarkable, something that would eventually move even a king. Chapter 8. The king notices word travels in kingdoms, even when it is not spoken aloud in formal reports. Stories pass from person to person, spreading through the informal networks that connect communities. A farmer mentions something to his neighbor. A traveler shares what he has seen. A merchant passing through tells a story in the next town. People had noticed the woman on the rock. How could they not? She had been there for months now through the entirety of the harvest season, through the building summer heat, maintaining her vigil with a determination that seemed almost inhuman in its constancy. Guards who passed through the area on patrol saw her. Farmers working nearby fields saw her. Shepherds moving their flocks past the hill saw her. Traders on the road saw her. And they talked about what they had seen. Not necessarily with any agenda or purpose, but simply because it was remarkable, because it was unusual, because there was something both heartbreaking and/or inspiring about a mother's refusal to abandon her dead sons. The story spread, It moved through villages and towns. It was mentioned in conversations at wells and in marketplaces. It reached the ears of officials and administrators who managed the day-to-day operations of the kingdom. And eventually, inevitably, it reached the ears of King David. David, who had made the decision to hand over the 7 men to the Gibeonites. David, who had been seeking to end a famine and honor a covenant and restore balance to a land that was suffering. David, who had thought the matter was resolved once the execution was carried out and the demands of justice were satisfied. He heard about Rizb. He heard that she had been there since the beginning of the harvest, that she had not left her post, that she had kept watch over the bodies day and night, protecting them from birds and beasts. He heard that she had endured the heat and the storms, that she had maintained her vigil with a faithfulness that seemed to defy explanation, and he was moved. David understood grief in ways that many people never have to understand it. His life had been marked by profound losses, by the deaths of people he loved deeply. He had lost Jonathan, his closest friend, his brother, in every way that mattered except blood. When Jonathan died on Mount Gilboa alongside his father Saul, David had mourned with a lament that was still remembered and recited among the people. How the mighty have fallen. He had lost sons of his own. Amnon killed by Absalom. Absalom himself killed during the rebellion, despite David's explicit orders to preserve his life. David's grief over Absalom had been so intense, so overwhelming that it had threatened to undermine his authority and turn his military victory into something that felt like defeat. David knew what it meant to love someone and to lose them. He knew what it meant to wish you could change the past, to bargain with God for different outcomes, to carry grief that never quite healed but remained as a permanent ache in the chest. And when he heard what Rizpah had done, when he heard about her months-long vigil, her refusal to abandon her sons even in death, he recognized the depth of her devotion. He recognized it because he had felt something similar himself, and he was moved to action. David gave an order. The bodies were to be gathered, all 7 of them. They were to be taken down from wherever they had been exposed and given proper burial. But David went further than that. He commanded that the bones of Saul and Jonathan, which had been buried hastily years before in Jabesh-Gilead, by brave men who had risked their lives to retrieve them after the battle on Mount Gilboa, should also be brought and given a proper resting place. They were to be buried in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, in the land of Benjamin. The family was to be reunited in death. Dignity was to be restored to the house that had fallen so far, that had suffered so much judgment in consequence. Honor was to be given, not because it had been earned or because anyone demanded it, but because it was right. Because even in judgment, there should be room for mercy. Because the dead deserved to be treated with respect regardless of the circumstances that had led to their deaths. And it was Rizpah's vigil that had prompted this action. Her refusal to abandon her sons had reminded a king of something he already knew, but had perhaps temporarily forgotten in the machinery of politics and justice. That behind every judgment, behind every execution, behind every act of state necessity, there were human beings who loved and grieved and deserved to be remembered. The order was given and it was carried out. The bodies were gathered with care. They were treated with the dignity that had been denied them in death. They were prepared for burial according to the customs of the time, and they were laid to rest in the tomb of Kish in the land of Benjamin, in the territory that had been Saul's homeland. Saul and Jonathan, the king and his son who had died together, Armon and Mephibosheth, Rizpah's boys, the 5 sons of Meab, all gathered together, all given the honor of proper burial, all allowed to rest at last. And Rizpah finally could leave her rock. Her vigil was complete, not because she'd given up or grown tired or been forced away, but because her sons were no longer alone and exposed on a hillside. They were home. They were honored. They were at rest. And she could rest too. Chapter 9. The famine ends. After the bodies were buried, something shifted in the land. It was subtle at first, perhaps not immediately obvious to everyone, but those who paid attention to the rhythms of nature, who knew the signs and patterns of weather and season, they noticed the rains came at the proper time, not the sporadic, unpredictable storms that had marked the previous years, but steady, reliable rains that soaked into the earth and replenished the water tables and filled the systems. The crops responded. The wheat that had struggled and failed for 3 years now grew strong and tall. The barley flourished. The vines produced abundant grapes. The olive trees bent under the weight of their fruit. The land which had seemed cursed now seemed blessed. The famine that had gripped Israel for 3 years began to lift, not gradually but suddenly, as though a switch had been flipped, as though some cosmic obstruction had been removed, and the natural order could function properly again. The people of Israel saw it. They saw the connection between the burial and the ending of the famine. They understood in the way that ancient peoples understood such things, that God had been watching not just the execution of justice, but the way that justice was carried out, that the demands of the covenant had been satisfied. Yes, but also that mercy had been shown, that the dead had been honored, that a mother's vigil had been noticed. The text is spare in its description, but the implication is clear. God responded to what had been done. The prayer that Israel had been making for 3 years, only after Risby's faithfulness had reminded everyone involved that even in the machinery of divine judgment and political necessity, compassion still mattered. The land healed, the people ate, the livestock fattened, the storehouses filled. Life returned to normal, or at least to the normal rhythms of agriculture and season that characterized life in ancient Israel. And they remembered Rizpah not as a queen or a prophet or anyone with power or status, but as a mother who had refused to abandon her sons, as a woman who had demonstrated a kind of faith that was all the more powerful for being so simple, so unadorned, so utterly human. Her name was recorded. Her story was preserved. The account of what she had done became part of the historical record, part of the scripture itself, because what she had done mattered not just to her sons, though certainly to them, not just to David, though he had been moved by it, but to the larger story of God's relationship with his people, to the ongoing question of how justice and mercy relate to each other, to the perpetual need for humans to remember that laws and covenants and political necessities must never completely erase the human beings at the center of every story. Rizpah's vigil became a witness not to her own righteousness or heroism, but to the power of faithful presence, to the reality that sometimes the most profound acts of devotion happen in silence and solitude, to the truth that God sees and honors the kind of love that does not need an audience or reward, that simply loves because that is what love does. The famine ended. The land produced again, and Rizpah at last could rest. Epilogue: faith that would not walk away. Rizpah's story is not a comfortable one. It does not fit neatly into the categories we often use to make sense of biblical narratives. It is not a story of triumph over evil or victory against impossible odds. It is not a story of miraculous deliverance or dramatic divine intervention. It is a story about grief and justice and the terrible cost of covenant obligations. It is a story about the way that individual human beings can be caught up in forces much larger than themselves, swept along by the machinery of divine judgment and political necessity, their own innocence or guilt almost irrelevant to the outcome. It is a story that raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, about collective guilt, about whether the sins of one generation should fall on the next. But it endures not because it provides easy answers or simple comfort, but because it speaks to something deeper than doctrine or theology. It speaks to the kind of faith that expresses itself not in words, but in presence. The kind of love that refuses to abandon even when there is nothing left to protect, but memory and dignity. The kind of devotion that stays when everything else has walked away. Risper did not perform miracles. She did not receive visions or hear the voice of God speaking directly to her with instructions or comfort. He were dead, and she expressed that love and were dead. And she expressed that love in the only way available to her, by refusing to let them spend their final days utterly alone and dishonored. Her vigil lasted months. Months of sitting on a rock in the heat and the rain. Months of driving away birds and animals. Months of enduring physical discomfort and emotional anguish that most people cannot even imagine. And she did it without complaint, without demands, without any expectation of recognition or reward. She did it because it needed to be done, because someone needed to stay, because love required it. And in that simple, stubborn faithfulness, she bore witness to something essential about the character of God himself, that he sees, that he notices the faithful vigil of a grieving mother on a barren hillside, that he honors the kind of faith that looks like quiet, enduring presence, rather than dramatic demonstration, that he does not forget those who refuse to forget, that he is moved by devotion, even when that devotion cannot change outcomes or alter circumstances. Risper's story is rarely told in churches and synagogues. It does not appear in children's Bible storybooks. It is not the subject of famous paintings or popular sermons, but perhaps it should be told more often, because there are times in every life when faith does not feel like triumph or victory or breakthrough. There are times when faith feels like staying on a rock in the heat and the rain, protecting something that cannot be saved, honoring something that the world has decided does not matter. There are times when all you can do is be present, when you cannot fix the situation or change the outcome or make things right, when you cannot bring back what has been lost or undo what has been done, when all you have left is your refusal to abandon, your determination to stay, your insistence that the person you love will not be forgotten or dishonored or left utterly alone. And in those times, Risper's story whispers a truth that is easy to forget. In a world that values results and outcomes and measurable success, God sees. The vigil is never in vain. The love is never wasted. The faith that stays even when everything else is gone. Even when there is no hope of changing anything, even when all you can do is be present, that faith matters. God noticed Whisper on her rock. He saw her faithfulness. He honored her devotion. And through her example, he reminded a king and a kingdom that mercy must always walk hand in hand with justice, that the dead deserve dignity, that love is never wasted even when it cannot change outcomes. The God who saw Rizpah still sees now. He still notices the faithful who stay when everyone else has left. He still honors the kind of devotion that does not need to be loud or public or recognized in order to be real and powerful. He still remembers those who remember. He still values presence. And in that truth, there is a kind of comfort that transcends circumstances, because it means that no act of faithful love is ever lost. No vigil is ever forgotten. No one who stays when staying is all they can do is ever truly alone. God sees, and that is enough. Risper eventually left her rock. She returned to whatever remained of her life after those months of vigil. The text does not tell us what happened to her after that, whether she found any measure of peace or joy, whether she ever recovered from the loss of her sons. But her story remains a testimony to the power of faithful presence, a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of faith happen in silence, a witness to the truth that love, real love, the kind that persists beyond death and dishonor, and every form of abandonment, that love is never wasted. Because God sees and he remembers. And the faith that would not walk away, the devotion that refused to leave, the love that stayed when everything else had gone. That faith is honored in ways that transcend our understanding. Risper's vigil ended when her sons were finally laid to rest with dignity and honor. But the meaning of her vigil echoes still, calling to anyone who has ever had to stay when staying seemed pointless. calling to anyone who has ever kept watch when there was no hope of changing anything. Calling to anyone who has ever loved beyond reason, beyond expectation, beyond any possibility of reward. Stay, it whispers. Your presence matters. Your faithfulness is seen. Your love is never ever wasted. God sees, and that is enough. And